Skyward Sword is controversial amongst Zelda fans. Many dislike it for its linearity and the motion controls, while others love it despite those things. Whether you love it or hate it, one thing that most can agree on is that its dungeons are a point in the game's favor. Skyward Sword contains some of the most unique and memorable dungeons in the series, and I'm excited to share my thoughts on them from my least favorite to my favorite. As always, this is just a personal opinion, not an objective analysis, so please don't be mad if your favorite ranks low on the list. This is FP Productions, and here's my Skyward Sword dungeon ranking. The Earth Temple, which is ironically one of the game's two fire-themed dungeons, is fun but straightforward. You go from room to room solving self-contained puzzles, and most of them don't really stand out in my memory. There are a couple that do, though. Before getting to the second half of the dungeon, you have to roll 2 boulders through the lava to push switches on either side of the bridge, and it can be tricky to keep your balance while fending off monsters. Later, after getting the boss key, a boulder descends from the jaws of an ancient dragon and chases you down the long path back to the boss door. Both of these instances are fun and unique, but they don't take a whole lot of creative thinking. The Earth Temple just doesn't do enough to put it any higher on the list. The Ancient Cistern is a unique dungeon that combines the themes of water and shadow and does new things with both of them. The upper floors consist of a giant, hollow statue surrounded by water, and beneath the statue lurks a cavern filled with poison, undead monsters, and a pile of bones. In order to beat the dungeon, you have to move the big statue up and down to make certain places in the underground part accessible. It's a clever puzzle that ties everything together, which is the kind of thing I enjoy. With all that said, why is Ancient Cistern so low on my list? Well, to be honest, I'm not sure. If this were an objective ranking, it would probably be a lot higher, but for some reason I've never enjoyed this dungeon as much as everyone else on the internet. Something about the vibe just doesn't appeal to me, and even though moving the statue makes for some tricky navigation, it never really confused me the way most water dungeons do. I guess I always found this place to be more straightforward than it seems like it was meant to be, and I wanted a little more out of it. The underground part definitely could have been longer, for example. Despite that though, it's still a really good dungeon, but I enjoyed the upcoming ones even more. This dungeon may not have a big central puzzle, but it's large and filled with several small but clever ones. The bulbs filled with water that you have to carry on your sword tip, the wall that you have to look at your map to figure out can be blown up, and all of the underground areas accessed with the magma mitts are just a few examples. It gives me a distinct Indiana Jones vibe with the riddles you have to solve and the ancient treasures they guard. Skyward Sword's linearity also pays off here, since the dungeon finds use for every single item in your inventory at this late point in the game. There's not much more to say about the Fire Sanctuary. It may not be a labyrinth, but it is a deep temple filled with fun obstacles. If you've followed my dungeon rankings up to this point, you've probably figured out that I'm a sucker for early game forest temples. Skyview Temple is straightforward, but as my first foray into the game's dungeons, I think it does an excellent job. The vibes are mysterious and unsettling, and the puzzles are clever considering how few items you have to work with. They force you to examine your environment closely and continually build on their concepts. For example, early on you have to figure out how to confuse the eye mechanism blocking your way forward, and later have to take on 3 at once. That's about all I've got in favor of Skyview, but if a dungeon has trees growing inside, I'm there for it. We've reached the point where Skyward Sword's dungeons spike in creativity, and its final one sets a higher bar than those of earlier games. It follows the usual trend of remixing ideas from earlier dungeons, but does so in a way that shatters any expectations. When you enter the first room, you're immediately given a dungeon map, which seems like a bad sign. My first thought was that the developers had gotten lazy and the last dungeon would be a piece of cake, but the truth is just the opposite. Once you're given the map, you gain the ability to change the dungeon layout in the style of a sliding tile puzzle. This one addition makes the Skykeep 10 times as memorable and challenging. You have limited options for how to move each room, and you have to connect the doorways until you gain access to each piece of the Triforce. There are multiple panels around the dungeon from which you can do this, leading to a variety of ways to progress. In a rare move for Skyward Sword, you can find the Triforce pieces in any order, and a couple rooms are skippable depending on how you arrange them. This gives the player freedom without making the dungeon a complete joke, unlike those of a certain other Zelda game. All that's not even mentioning the specific puzzles of each room, which are clever in their own right. Even though the ideas themselves have already been used elsewhere, their difficulty is increased to the max, and you really have to think about what you're doing. This makes Skykeep a dungeon with fun individual rooms and a unifying central obstacle in the style of Majora's Mask, and seals its place in my top 3. The first of 2 dungeons found in the desert, Lanayru Mining Facility combines the themes of sand and electricity. This sounds like it shouldn't work, but in context it absolutely does. Just like on the journey there, the facility makes use of timeshift stones that revert it between its present and past states. In the present, it's a desolate ruin filled with layers of sand and scorpions, and in the past it's a technologically advanced factory filled with machines. This unique setting is instantly memorable and makes for some great puzzles. The range of each timeshift stone is limited, and the same goes for the portable timeshift orbs. Through them, the past and the present interact, creating new paths but blocking others. You often have to position the stones in precise spots so that you get the best of both worlds. It's very hard to explain, but if you've played the game, you know what I'm talking about. And if not, please try the Switch version later this year because you're missing out. But anyway, the mining facility is long, has a unique setting, and is filled with clever puzzles, making it my second favorite in the game. Coming in at number 1 is the second desert dungeon, the Sandship. It borrows the same ideas as the mining facility, switching between deserted ruins and their technological counterpart, but uses these elements even more creatively. First of all is the setting. In my Twilight Princess video, I mentioned how I love when dungeons take place in other kinds of locations, and a ship is one of those. You really get the feeling of boarding an enemy vessel and taking it over, but when you first enter it's eerily silent and empty. The dry, dusty halls are long abandoned, with only a few scorpions stirring. Then you encounter the mini-boss, the ship's robotic captain, who's been here for untold centuries, and challenge him to one of the game's best one-on-one duels. Once you defeat him and obtain the bow, brand new possibilities open up. Just like the previous desert dungeon, you have to switch between past and present for very clever spatial reasoning puzzles, this time with added swashbuckling action. Freeing captives, looting hidden treasure, and ziplining between the upper masts is just part of the fun. Even though I'm not factoring bosses into my ranking, I have to mention the build-up to the Tantalus fight as well. Racing up a ship while some unknown leviathan batters it from outside is simply epic, even if the boss itself ends up being slightly disappointing. Overall, the Sandship combines all my favorite elements: unique setting, tricky navigation, clever puzzles, and straight-up fun. Well, that concludes my Skyward Sword dungeon ranking. With that, my dungeon ranking series comes to an end, unless someone has a request for one of the 2D games or Breath of the Wild. I hope you enjoyed the video, and feel free to share your favorite dungeons in the comments. This is FP Productions, and I'll see you next time.